Don't fall asleep. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Ehrenwerth. I'm the president and CEO of the Water Institute, and it's a real delight to have all of you here. I recognize and was just saying to my fellow panelists, we have a daunting task. We have to talk about how some of the projects and ideas that we've been talking about during the course of the day were actually implemented. And we have to do that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after you've been here all day and you know that there's a tour of a remarkable river model followed by a cocktail hour. So this is a rather tricky place to be. But thank you for being here. I just want to say to begin just a couple words about the Water Institute. You've had the chance to hear from a number of my colleagues. You heard from Dr. Ehab Maselli, from Jeff Hebert, and you'll hear from Dale Morris tomorrow, and a number of my colleagues are also here with us today. I want to tell you briefly the story, because Senator Landrieu is here, and the story really begins with her and her vision. So after Katrina, Senator Landrieu got a bunch of people together and said, we have a water problem in South Louisiana, clearly. We need to go and figure out where the best ideas around water are coming from. And so she and the leadership of the Baton Rouge Area Foundation, the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, and a number of people from across this state and this community got together and they started taking trips over to the Netherlands. And they took trips over to the Netherlands and they saw a number of projects. The Dutch, of course, have been protecting their coastline for the last 800 years. And in 1953, they had, of course, a horrific water disaster. And they've really done some remarkable things. And so during the course of those trips and seeing the projects, they were impressed in a number of respects, but one of the things that really stuck with them is they saw an entity called Deltares. And we have a couple of our colleagues from Deltares here today. Carl, there's Edwin was in the back, and Carl is here. You'll hear from him tomorrow. But they're very impressed with what they saw. Deltares, if you're not familiar with them, they're around 850 of the most brilliant scientists in the world, working on coastal and deltaic issues. And so when the group from Louisiana, led by Senator Landrieu, got back, they were talking, they said, that Deltares is pretty impressive. We need to get us one of them. And so they conceived of the Water Institute. And they recruited my predecessor, a brilliant hydrologist named Chip Grote, who was here earlier. I don't know if Chip's still here, but who then went off and recruited a number of the most talented scientists from around the state and around the world. So we are now around about 40 people. We have in that number 40, 11 different countries represented. So we are quite diverse, and the day where everybody brings in the food, their favorite food from the home. It's a very interesting lunch that day. But the idea was really twofold in creating the Water Institute. Number one, you needed to bring the best available science to the challenges we face in Louisiana and use that science and that analysis and those tools to help us save our way of life. And then the second chapter, which we are in now as well, is to take those ideas and not only use them here in Louisiana, but look for opportunities around the country and around the world for other groups, other communities who have similar challenges for us to help and bring the best science to those communities as well. So, Senator Landrieu, we're very grateful for your leadership and your vision. It's wonderful to be in this space, and wonderful to really tell you about this notion of partnership. So what this panel is about and what these gentlemen will talk about during the course of the next hour is not just the brilliant ideas, not just what it is that we think we need to do, but the dirty and difficult work of actually doing it. And the theory behind the Water Institute and the work that you'll hear about is that there's no one entity, there's no one discipline that can solve the challenges that we face. Whether it's sea level rise, subsidence, getting ready for the next storm, we know that it will take an all hands on deck, that it's interdisciplinary, or that's not very hip to say, transdisciplinary kind of mindset where you need to bring nonprofit, academia, private sector, government, all together to tackle these issues. So I'm delighted to, I will follow the suit of my fellow moderators, and I will not introduce these esteemed colleagues, but actually ask them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work. And as the conversation goes, I will also suggest, I'm excited to tell you about a project that a number of us are working on in Lake Charles and in Calcasieu, as well as another project in Fouchon that brings some of these ideas together. So with that, Jeff, please enlighten us with some of your exciting activities.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Justin. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. There might be some slides coming up here. I'm going to stand up, though. And stand so I don't fall.
Right up there.
Where's the clicker?
The clicker's right
Oh, got it. Okay. I didn't know someone else was doing it. Wow. Do I have to point it?
I think they're getting loaded now.
Okay. Well, my name's Jeff Carney. This will take a second anyway. I'm Jeff Carney. I'm the former director of the LSU Coastal Sustainability Studio. I'm an associate professor in the School of Architecture and former just recently. I will be moving to the University of Florida in the fall to be a part of a new opportunity there called the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience, or FIBRE for short. And so the work that we've done, and starting with, I'll talk about the Coastal Sustainability Studio, the other thing hasn't started yet. But the Coastal Sustainability Studio was started in 2009, and this was really much in the wake of Katrina, and then Rita, Gustav, and Ike, the tremendous amount of storms we had in those years. And the initial goal of it was to get, quite simply, scientists, engineers, and designers around the same table to think transdisciplinarily around these issues. And really what that means is that it's not capital R research. It is, I'd say, capital A for applied research. Everything that we do is bringing those people to the table to solve problems, usually in collaboration with a client. And that sometimes in the university setting can be, it doesn't quite fit sometimes in the sort of capital R research model. I show this image because I think one of the founding principles of the studio was that we can see this as a threat. We can talk about mitigating risk, and we could spend the rest of our lives mitigating risk. There's a lot of it to mitigate. But as designers, we see that as an opportunity. This is either land loss, storm surge, sea level rise, or it's the power of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River has built this environment. This is an image which you'll see when you walk across the street too. The 8,000 years that it took to build the Mississippi Delta with the Mississippi River. It's taken us about 75 years to lose 2,000 years worth of this construction. And if you think about that, we did that because we were mitigating risk. So sometimes we lose sight of the actual opportunity that exists. And so I think that as a design group, that's what we try to think about. What is the opportunity in this environment? This is an image, and actually we did quite some time ago, thinking about the I-10 corridor. And I think it sets the stage for really where our work has gone in terms of thinking across the boundary, or across the sort of spectrum from coastal protection and restoration in a large-scale land building sense, and the scale that CPRA is taking on through the master plan, all the way to the scale of community adaptation, individual decisions, the conceptualization of risk. And I think a lot of the people talking about communication, the last speaker talking about insurance, the ability or the desire of someone to purchase insurance, that whole range. I think at a time there have been times where it's, well, we can't build the coast and also retreat from it. That's counterintuitive. But I don't think it is. I think we live in a dynamic environment. We live in an environment that's always changing. So how do we build this environment, maintain this environment, expand upon it, at the same time realize that it's a dynamic and moving environment? So a lot of our work spans the scope of visualization, education work, design research and synthesis amongst different disciplines, all the way to vision concepts looking sort of 100 years down the line. Structurally, I kind of see the way we work. It's a studio. It's a big table. When a project comes in, we determine teams that fit the project, right? We are mostly science, engineering, and design, but we've been joined by some 20 disciplines over the last 8 years from across campus. And so the last image, this is a rendition of the 2016 floods we had here in Baton Rouge. This is a lot of where our work has moved to, the project called Inland from the Coast. a lot of communities are adapting. There's a lot of migration that's happening. We're migrating to places like Baton Rouge. And for those of you not from around here, we had a massive flood in 2016. So this project as a case study brings 10 disciplines from 3 institutions together. That's LSU, Louisiana Sea Grant, and UNO, from 10 disciplines, and that's from social work to civil engineering, geography, design, together to work with the professional organizations. So that's the AIA, the APA, the American Planning Association, American Institute of Architects, American Society of Landscape Architects, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, together as our public engagement component of this. So that's the kind of work we're doing, looking at sort of the adaptation of the increased resilience, health, and well-being issues around Baton Rouge. So I will pass it off at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Next, we'll hear from Marc Davis.
Thank you. I don't have slides. I'm a lawyer. I don't have to have slides.
You're going to get a question about what that meant later.
And when I get my retainer, I'll answer that question. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm here in a couple of capacities. You know, I hang around with Justin and his team all the time anyway. My current gig is I'm at Tulane Law School, where I direct the Institute on Water Resources Law and Policy. I'm also the director of the Tulane Bywater Institute, which is a fairly recent creation that Tulane put together to coordinate interdisciplinary work focused on resilience, sustainability in the water arena. And it reflects Tulane's realization that water and resilience are not just something to study, but something they have to practice. Because Tulane, which happens to be, I think, the largest private employer in the metro New Orleans area, finds itself in a city that's very vulnerable, and a coast that's more vulnerable. And if it wants to attract students, faculty members, donors, it actually has to do more than just study things. It's a beneficiary of all this work, and it doesn't know how to do it. It's not what universities were set up to do. That's fine. Most institutions weren't set up to do the things we're now asking them to do. From the standpoint of partnering, that means that there are parts of campus that have to work together that have never worked together. There are disciplines on campus that we say hi to each other in the faculty dining room. We sometimes talk to each other's classes, but that is not really purposeful. I want to talk about what, first of all, let's talk about what we mean by a partnership. Generally speaking, a partnership is a combination of 2 or more people who come together to make contributions for a common purpose. Just hanging out together, talking about the same things is not a partnership. Coming together to celebrate, somebody's accomplishments is not a partnership. These are all fine things, but partnerships are about doing things. And they're about every person, every participant having a role and responsibilities. They are hard work. They don't all work, and they don't all last. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to know what we mean when we use these terms. I personally have had experience with the kind of institutional partnerships that Tulane is exploring, because we can't do these things alone, so we're exploring collaborations with the Water Institute of the Gulf, any number of other institutions. I was just palling around with the folks in Newport News in Norfolk, because it turns out that the folks at the Navy base there have the same challenges. Folks at William and Mary have the same challenges. The folks at Old Dominion University have the same challenges. And everyone's looking for someone else to help them think through what needs to be done. So you have interdisciplinary partnerships, you have institutional partnerships, and you have civic partnerships. I have some experience with that because I see Kim Ryer, who walked in. On the second floor of this building is more than just the Water Institute of the Gulf. It's also where the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana is headquartered. Coalition, if you don't know it, it was a civic partnership. It still is. But if you go back to the 1980s, when the coast was not really talked about. If you went to any federal agency and said, hey, by the way, this coast is disappearing like Jeff Carney will tell you about 30 years from now, they would tell you, that's interesting, that's not our job. If you went to any state agency in the state of Louisiana and said, by the way, part of our state is disappearing and it's going to take a whole lot of our communities and things with it, the answer would be, that's great, it's not my jurisdiction. There were only 2 parishes in the state of Louisiana that recognized this as really being a crisis. So these folks, some of whom were individuals, some of whom were civic, some of which were business, some of which came with a commercial focus or a philosophical or theological. The churches were big. Because keep in mind, churches in places like South Louisiana are huge, things that hold communities together. They are the social service hub for many communities. They saw a disappearing coast as affecting the entire community. That's where the energy to create a coastal restoration program came from. They didn't set out to write laws, but they did. They wrote the laws that created, ultimately, the CPRA that you've heard from. They created the laws, in 1991, on the federal side against long odds. And this was not just Louisiana people in this coalition at this point. That for the first time, made it clear that, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers had environmental enhancement and restoration as a mission area. That was not acknowledged before. The inundation of over 2,000 square miles was not a flood. We didn't know what it was. It took a partnership of institutions and individuals to make it somebody's job. That was not easy work, I can promise you. But they had enough common purpose, and that was essentially, would there still be a coastal Louisiana to live in and argue about 75 to 100 years later, that made it worth their while. I first got involved in 1991, shortly after those laws had been passed. I was a board member. The board had about 35 people from all sorts of walks of life, and I was a corporate lawyer before that. And if anyone had told me to put together an organization with 35 board members from probably 45 points of view, I would have told them find another lawyer. This is not going to work. The first thing they did is they acknowledged that they'd passed these laws, they'd now made these things someone's job. First order of business is, should our partnership dissolve? Had this coalition done what it set out to do? Mary Landrew will remember this individual, Bob Jones, who was the parish engineer, Terrebonne Parish. He raised his hand and said, I don't know about the rest of you, but Terrebonne Parish did not get in this to pass laws. We got in this to save this coast. I don't think we've done that yet. So the partnership continued. I bring this up because I then became their executive director, and I can tell you that it was not an easy thing to manage. I had a huge amount to learn. And being a lawyer, it was not necessarily what I was set up to learn. But that is the essence of what we're having to deal with when we go into this space. These are non-traditional. And the first thing that group of individuals learned was you could not ask, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, to become their partners for something they were not authorized to do. Keep in mind that when we're dealing with these people, it's easy to talk as though we're all individuals. Let's get somebody from that agency into the room, we'll talk to them, bring someone from navigation in, and we'll all have dinner and make a deal. If it's not in your mission area, there's only so much you can agree to do. And we have to respect that. But if it's nobody's job to accomplish the task, then you do not have yourself a partnership. I was involved in cleaning up a hazardous waste site once, and it got very contentious. And one of the other people in the room actually worked for a refinery, and it was going south fast, and he kept wondering, when is someone going to step in and be the adult in this room and kind of take command? And then it dawned on him that if you have to ask the question, whose job is it? It might be yours.
And Mark, on that note,
And so I just wanted to say that
as the job of the moderator,
partnerships begin with someone broaching the idea to people who have the authority and the willingness to do something about it. If you can't find those people or institutions, you may have to create them.
thank you, and I really appreciate that. And before we move on, I wanted to pause for a moment because you've both, the first two panelists, I think, have hit on a number of issues, and I'm curious to ask a question of both of you because I think the answer will be informative and different. You've described bringing people together from different backgrounds, Jeff, and that's what the studio is really about. Well, sometimes they speak different languages, or they approach questions from a completely different perspective. Can you give an example of how you worked through it in real life and you were able to break through the siloed training that these people from different disciplines brought with them?
Yeah, I could give, how much time? How much time do we have? We have had so many examples. And I would say, first is Mark's right, it doesn't always work. We've had examples that have gone off the rails. And that's part of it, really. And if you set it up right, then that's okay. We all part ways, and it's okay. But some people aren't meant to do multidisciplinary work. I mean, there are deep people that want to do the deep dive, and I think that's fantastic. I think the most important thing for us is projects. And the projects, as a designer, I think there's a difference between solving a problem perfectly, knowing that your solution is absolutely correct, or in a sort of one sense of solving the problem. Another sense is a design problem, where we are working with the best available knowledge, we have a time constraint, we might have a budget, and we have a client who's got certain desires. And that iterative design thinking approach, I think when we can couch problems there, it helps a lot. And there is a sort of practice mentality to that, which is a challenge, I think, definitely, especially in an academic environment where, as an architect, we're practitioners, I think, in a lot of ways that a lawyer or a medical doctor is. That's where our field operates. In some cases, science and engineering can be much more academic. And so coming into a more practice realm, that we've had challenges with that. But I do think that the bringing projects to the table, which is the nature of the word transdisciplinary, is that applied aspect to multidisciplinary work, has been key. Otherwise, and I am an architect speaking, space matters. I mean, having a space where we have a big table where we work on a project. And so, the example that I would bring is the changing course competition, where we were working with West 8, Deltares, Moffitt and Nickel, I'm going to forget people, but the CSS, we had 9 faculty members from across campus with 35 different people of different disciplines. It was the 2 or 3 day charrettes that we ran in the studio where we had this team together. And I mean, a few of us are here today. I mean, there were moments when we thought it wasn't going to work. But that face-to-face was really important. So again, I mean, that project was a fantastic example of that. It forced everyone to bring their particular research interests and to some extent check them at the door and come in with their expertise, but geared towards solving a particular problem.
Well, thank you. And Mark, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I think you highlighted for us something that's very important in this question of partnerships of what's success, when do you declare it versus when do you need to keep going. But I think, Jeff, your comments are such a nice segue, Edgar, into some of what you're going to present from the research by design perspective and more. So please come forward.
Sure, thank you. I do have a couple of slides, even though I admit that this exciting view is hard to beat. Let me jump straight into it. So this is the reality. You know, I'm not sharing anything new here. This is about our waterfronts, how our waterfronts are being used, and how there's a lot of pressure on our waterfronts. And this is, you know, a global challenge, a global opportunity. And it's something we are managing when it comes to resilience, I would almost say at a daily basis with all its challenges. This is my reality, New York City, this is where I live. In this image you see about 4 million people. This is the home to 4 million people. And you also see the Sandy impact. You know, astonishing numbers, and I would argue numbers that are still counting, 60 billion in damage. No one really understands what the damage is. 6 years into Sandy, almost 90,000 buildings that were affected, almost 25,000 businesses that were part of that, 2 million jobs that were interrupted, people that could not come to their job after Sandy. This was the result of this. I biked through Sandy, the day before Sandy. I biked through the city also, of course, the day after Sandy, making a lot of photos of the critical assets that you see here, assets that turned out to be clients when I started with Arcadis as a flood risk and resilience lead as part of the TKI practice with Arcadis. So I think, you know, this is what we are really talking about. This is flood risk, probability, consequence, and what it means to our urban spaces. Cities are growing, so it gives a lot of tension, population and development. A 3D image of Rotterdam, city of Rotterdam, if you were to overlay that image with all the assets that you have at stake, 90% of the city approximately is below sea level, then you understand what the implications are. It also shows, you know, why the Dutch have that tremendous protective system, up to once in a 10,000 year for our primary system. This is the guy that is also important when it comes to New York, Robert Moses. I'm still reading his book. It's pretty impressive. I'm halfway, so don't quote me on all the things I'm saying out of that book. But what is intriguing is the way he was doing the work he was doing. And he was doing a lot in the 30 years about that he was in office. He made amazing things happen in the city. Things that you can still enjoy, and certain things not enjoy so much because they're in pretty poor shape in many places. But this is the reality. This is the reality of, you know, designs from the past, 60, 70 years ago. And if you were to overlay this with, you know, the accelerated sea level rise, the curves that you're all familiar with, then you understand that we have a tremendous challenge. A challenge that we attacked as part of Rebuild by Design. I was the Rebuild by Design lead for Arcadis. Involved in the big U. This is the alignment that we studied in 12 different compartments. The first compartment is happening, probably breaking ground early next year, 2.5 miles, the lower east side, the lowest part of that alignment. Well, you probably know this guy, Henk Ovink. He brought a process to New York. So not just, you know, solutions. What are we going to do? The solutions that you see in that biggest circle, integrated solutions, multi-layered solutions. We know about that. He also brought, you know, financial thoughts and a BCA understanding to our process. But most important, he brought a stakeholder process. He brought stakeholders to the table in what he called a sabbatical detour. Not something, you know, that we as engineers are so familiar with, a straight line from A to B, which is the shortest route. No, he brought the fastest route, which is that tremendous detour that you see there. Also a challenge for us as engineers, because working with architects, so to speak, many other people that were involved, we had to give that a reality check as well, because it was going in many directions, especially in the beginning. This was a challenge, and it's a challenge that we have made part of our current practice. A couple of examples I'm showing here. These are the gates that we are currently designing, because above all, a process can be great, and Rebuild by Design turned out to be a great process, because the works that are currently happening in New York to quite an extent are the Rebuild by Design projects, proposals. But it also needs to work. Flood protection solution need to work. You see here floodgates we are designing. Places where we do have more space, like the East River Park, that's where we are utilizing space, connecting communities to the water, the water that they value as their biggest asset. So how can you leverage that quality and turn it into something that can actually be enjoyed 99% of the time that you don't see the circumstances on the right. So I'm making a quick jump here, and please keep Robert Moses in mind here as well. You're all familiar with the tunnel projects in Boston, a tremendous pain in the neck when you need to drive through that in rush hour. Overlay that again with the risk, the climate risk that Boston is facing at its waterfront, and you see a tremendous challenge. And that is not something from the future. Boston had 3 major events. 2 of them happened this year alone. So people don't really care all that much about, you know, what is the 100th year, what is the 500th year. People really care more about when is water breaching the waterfront edge. We calculated that to be around 2035, 2040 as part of Climate Ready Boston, also as part of the South Boston work that we do. They want to understand what are we going to do next year. So we bring the same principles that we practiced during Rebuild by Design with our stakeholders, working with our stakeholders, the business community mostly in South Boston, the Seaport District, 500 in total, 500 firms with their own arrangement when it comes to insurance, their own arrangement when it comes to parking, accessibility, you name it, all the things that are critical to running a business in a city like Boston. Please take a look at this image and also look again at this one. You see the tremendous transition, only 100 years. And I think this is an example of where we need to allow ourselves to think more freely about what the next 50 years will look like for the Seaport District, because this waterfront will see tremendous changes again. Tremendous changes, not just because of sea level rise, also the growing population, but just to the images you see on the top line, there's a serious threat that Boston might go back to a situation that we've seen in the past when land was being reclaimed. This is zooming in on the Seaport District. It doesn't show the inundation of this area. It also shows the inundation pathways to the rest of the city. So this explains that collaboration is needed beyond what we are talking about in this district. This is also something Boston is taking on actively. So it's not just this study area. Other firms are involved in a study for East Boston. There's a study about the barrier. Boston is actively connecting those dots as well, really making it more regional, making it bigger, but at the same time not shying away from what needs to happen in these kind of places. So a couple of conclusions here. First one is, we need to design a process. And I was in Miami yesterday as part of a big conference, which was all about data, data mining, data interpretation. But there was a quick jump from data to solutions. And there was no talk about process whatsoever. So that's going to be a challenge. I mean, we all know that Miami is going to be a challenge by itself, but we need to define a process, which is a job by itself. Understanding climate risk and vulnerabilities, well, we've heard a lot already today about data. Data is key behind this. We want to make sure that there's scientific proof of everything we are doing, which feeds into climate risk and the vulnerabilities. And we also need to invent new rules, because we know that the landscape is changing. What you see here in the background is an art project from 2010 when we were playing soccer in the fields. The beginning was pretty challenging, but after some practice, these teams really knew how to do this. This is my last slide, and I would welcome you to Google Holland.com. I'd never done it before. I did it this morning. This is what I found. This, to me, is about identity. It's the identity of water management. What does it mean? I'm not just selling tulips or wooden shoes. This is really what makes communities a community. And with that, I would like to thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And our last panelist is Marc Goodson.
So the only thing tougher than being on the last panel of the day is being the last panelist on the last panel of the day. But I'll do my best to keep this lively. I'm Marc Goodson. I'm the Resilience Practice Lead at CSRS. We're a firm headquartered right here in Baton Rouge, and we offer lots of really cool services, all aimed at helping build safer and stronger communities. Hopefully I don't burn through all my time just framing this, but kind of the backdrop of what I was hoping to share today relative to collaboration in this resilient space is a really fascinating and exciting project that's happening right here in Louisiana, but I think it's important to kind of build the context before I dive into it. So picking up on something that Alex said in the very first panel of the day, he talked about how there are risks that are random and predictable, and there are risks that are constant and predictable, and those that are constant and predictable, in his opinion, are uninsurable. And I don't disagree with that. So how do we address those risks? How do we protect ourselves if they're not insurable? One way to do it, and the term has been kicked around a few times today, is through adaptation. If something's happening constantly over a period of time and predictably over a period of time, though relatively slowly, you've got time to do something about it. Namely adapt, that is, change the way that you live in such a way that you reduce that risk. And I have to brag on our state for a minute, because Louisiana is really, I believe, on the forefront of adaptation, particularly around coastal communities. And so the project that I'm going to mention very briefly in just a second is really a demonstration project of a larger initiative called LA Safe, which is an adaptation program, starting with really planning and moving now into the capitalization of real projects in communities, starting with 6 coastal parishes. That's our equivalent of a county, if you're not from Louisiana, and really thinking through, all right, there are 3, based on the foremost thinking and science that we have at our disposal, thankfully here in Louisiana, thanks to places like CPRA and the Water Institute, and looking ahead at flood risk, in particular on our coast, there are really 3 typologies of communities. Those, you saw some of the data visualization earlier today, those that over a 50-year time horizon are going to cease to exist, unfortunately. We have a working coast, and so there are some really critical economic assets along our coast. So there are those that will continue to be vulnerable, but because they're so important to our state and frankly our nation, economically, we've got to find ways to fortify those things so that they can remain here and remain operational. And then lastly, there are those communities on the high ground that are going to have to receive this population that's migrating. Jeff talked about it earlier. And so how can we plan those communities to be smarter about the way that they grow and the way that they receive this influx of people migrating out of harm's way over time? And so, this demonstration project that I referenced is called the Ilda Jean Charles Resettlement Project. Ilda Jean Charles is an island community off the coast of Terrebonne Parish, sort of due south, a little southeast of where we are now. It's an island that has lost over 98% of its landmass over the last 60 years, and has really gone from a secluded but thriving community of hundreds of people to really just the bare bones of a community that's there but has a rich heritage and a rich history and tradition. And the folks there, for the most part, understand that they're at risk and would like to resettle. And so the state received funding through HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition a couple years ago to help fund this project. And our firm has got the pleasure, along with other folks in this room, of leading the team that's planning through that resettlement process. I just hit the green button? Okay, great. So this is really simple, but the resettlement project is sort of broken into 3 phases as the state's laid it out. One was about outreach and needs assessment. That's already happened. That was about, okay, big picture, we understand what's happening here and what needs to be done, but let's really ground truth and let's get a snapshot of what's happening on the island today, what those people are really looking for, what they want to do. The second is what's underway, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a moment. And then lastly will ultimately be the development and construction of a new community on the high ground for the folks that so choose from the island to move to, and hopefully establish a new, vibrant, and growing community that's out of harm's way. This is another simple illustration really to make the point, and it says resettlement at the top, that could very well apply to adaptation more broadly. But the point is that community planning is part of this. Planning this new community in particular is really important, but it's so much more than that. It's also what I'm calling program development. And it's about thinking through, how is this resettlement going to happen? If I'm from a resident's perspective, do I stay or do I go? What do I get in the process? What happens to my home back on the island? I want to live close to my neighbors in the new community. I don't want to live anywhere near my neighbors in the new community. All of these things are things that have to be worked out in the process, and part of our charge is to create a replicable model that can hopefully be reproduced in other places in Louisiana and elsewhere, even without an infusion of federal money. Oh, and the arrows that connect the two, the smaller arrows connecting the two primary arrows, is just to show that there's lots of points of intersection between the two. And that really sets the stage for this slide, which is because there's so much going on and so much intersection between the program development and the planning, there is really a requirement for a vast array of skill sets in order to deal with this. So we've talked a lot today about resilience, and that it is, at least in part, really looking at the world through the lens of it's a mass of interconnected systems. And if you really want to build resilience, you have to address all or most of those systems. And not many of us or our firms or our organizations are equipped to handle all the systems on our own. And so it really requires pulling in multiple skill sets and multiple sets of expertise. I should note, Pat Forbes is here from the State Office of Community Development. They're driving this. This is the state's project, and so the really web of expertise you see here represents kind of the private sector's response on our team. I'm sure Pat would tell you the web is probably even bigger on the government side in terms of all the skill sets that they bring into this effort on their side. But it just hopefully begins to illustrate, and it's not exhaustive, but all the different backgrounds and expertise that are required. We've got a few social scientists on our team. One is a cultural anthropologist who's one of the foremost experts globally in disaster resettlement, and he tells us every day, this is not a planning project, it's not a policy project, it's not a land development project, it's a people project. It's a social project, and it's true. Well, the truth really is it's all of those things. And so you've got to walk into something this fascinatingly complex, you've got to be well equipped. And some of the questions, I've got some lessons learned already that I can share. This project's very much still ongoing. But that's definitely one, is that you've really got to bring everything you have to bear in order to address all of these different systems that make up a community. So as I mentioned, Ilda Jean Charles has lost most of its land mass. It was once a thriving and lush island in the midst of a marsh. These are some old USGS maps you can kind of see, starting from the late 1800s, as canals were dug and levees were built, how the landscape has changed over time into now what is really an open water condition on the right there. So it's a very tenuous position that this community is in. This is what it looks like today. And really the bones of the community are still there, organized along the bayou, the Jean Charles, which is the linear kind of water feature through the middle of the island. And there are communities organized along Island Road in a linear fashion that are there. Some occupied by permanent residents, some are folks who have recreational camps there for fishing and other things. There's really one business enterprise left. It's a marina that's also sort of the social hub for the folks that live there as well. This is approaching the island on Island Road. It's the only way in other than by boat. A strong southerly wind will inundate this road. And so it may not survive the next large storm event. And so it becomes a real issue because there are no other services available on the island. So for school, for healthcare, for groceries, pretty much anything that the folks on the island need, they've got to get off of the island at present to get those services. And that's a risky proposition on some days, several months out of the year, actually. So, part of our charge is understanding how the folks have lived on the island and adapted over time. It's really kind of this whimsical, ramshackle way that folks have adapted over time. This is existing housing that's there. They've got these thresholds that cross the bayou. As I mentioned, they're all sort of organized in this linear fashion across the bayou. But understanding, as they live today on the island, what's most important for them to carry forward to the new community is a big part of the conversations that we're having. So that new community, a site has been optioned by the state. It's about 40 miles north of Ilda Jean Charles, still in Terrebonne Parish, and out of the 500-year flood projections, so on high ground, much closer to some larger communities, Thibodeau and Houma, much closer to most of the essential services that folks that will be moving from the island will need. And this is just an illustration of adapting, in this case, to a better condition. So the top is the island as of today. So base flood elevation is 16 feet. That's the red dashed line. You can see what the existing condition. Now, these people are living with risk every day. In the new community, it's a much different proposition. But there are some natural features. It was mentioned earlier about the natural ridges along bayous and rivers here that we think can create some interesting ways of recreating that linear community that exists on the island while making sure that we build on the high ground and kind of set the precedent for what new development in South Louisiana could look like. Part of our charge in creating this sustainable, replicable model is a balanced community, balanced between development and nature, and economically or financially balanced in such a way that we hope the community and the commercial development that could take place there is enough to sustain the ongoing operations of the community over time. And so, thinking through the idea of maintaining this secluded community that these people still want, the residents still want, with access to these natural areas. There's, a large kind of spine of wetland area through the middle of the new site, but taking advantage of the economically viable and marketable property on the front to help create that balance that we're referring to. These are all things that we're thinking about. This is looking at it again in section view, and you can see on the far right, creating that residential community along that natural ridge. That's a bayou blue that's there, recreating to some extent that feel of organizing the community along a water body in this linear fashion, while creating a buffer between the community, the residential side that is, and the commercial enterprises that we hope go there. And I'll close with just a snapshot of what the new site looks like, just to give you an idea of the natural. Yes, it really is a tragic story that they're having to leave a community that generations have lived there for hundreds of years. But there's also some natural beauty and assets and a lot of promise in the new community, and this is an image from the new site. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. What our intention was in this panel was to really give everybody here an opportunity to not only understand some very complicated ideas that we've talked about during the course of the day and what goes into making some of these decisions, but really talk through some of the real life examples. It's fitting that we concluded that the presentations with Marc Goodson's, because in South Louisiana, and we're delighted to host this first 10X conference, we didn't ask for this crisis. We didn't ask to be at the tip of the spear at sea level rise and subsidence in the next storm. We didn't ask for the first set of what the New York Times calls climate change refugees, but we're confronting it. And I think what you've heard through from all of these panelists is how they're actually tackling it, what some of the challenges are, how you bring people from different disciplines together, what we've been doing in this geography, what we've done with our partners, with firms like Arcadis in other parts of the country. So our hope really is that you walk away from this piece, and I'm going to ask for questions and comments now, with not just an understanding of the challenges, not just an understanding of the science and the data and the tools that are required, but how it actually gets implemented, how it actually gets to that last point that Marc was making around. This is not just about the environment, this is also about the people. So with that, I'd be very interested to hear if there are questions or comments.
I have a question. And this is mainly for Marc, but for you too, Justin. So for the Ilda Jean Charles resettlement, can you talk a little bit about how the state got there in terms of making that initial decision to resettle this community as opposed to other political policy decisions, and sort of also what type of resistance you encountered in getting them to agree to move their community as opposed to continuing to live with the risk?
Yeah, great questions. Tough to kind of boil it all down to a 5-minute presentation. And I would say that the state is the resource for the background. So I'll touch on it quickly, but would invite all of you to explore it further. There's a website. The state maintains a website on the project that has additional background information, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk offline as well and give you the full story. But as I appreciate it, the Ilda Jean Charles community has been endeavoring to resettle for quite some time now, since the 90s, when the Corps of Engineers made the decision to not include Ilda Jean Charles in the Morganza to the Gulf structural protection system. And in so doing, it sort of sealed their fate in terms of there's no structural solution for keeping that island above water. And so the community there has been working, and there have been 2 failed attempts actually prior to this one to resettle the community. And so representatives from that community had brought this idea to the parish and then to the state, and the state, in its wisdom, included in its application to HUD for the National Disaster Resilience Competition, and it was selected along with that LA Safe program that I mentioned earlier. So it's pretty cool that there's this larger adaptation planning program going on, and this really important demonstration project is part of it, all funded through the NDRC grant. In terms of how was the community itself, how did they receive kind of the idea of resettling? I would say that, it's not been easy, and they'll tell you, they remind us regularly that they're in mourning, as exciting as it may seem to get to move to a shiny new community that's out of harm's way, closer to services and civilization than they've been for centuries. This is a place that they are extremely connected to, and their roots go back very deep. And so I think they all, or many of them, I shouldn't say all, but they understand the risk, and they understand that they need to move, but it still doesn't make it an easy process or even necessarily an easy decision. And there are, like any community or family, there are all kinds of dynamics, and it's not always a smooth process. But I would say it's gotten smoother as we've worked through it, especially now as we're really working on planning for the new community. And sorry, I didn't have any real planning and design drawings to show. They're not ready for public consumption yet, but really switching the focus in part to what that new community could become has changed. I think that narrative with the community some too. They see kind of the opportunity and the promise that exists as part of the project. So I think that has helped.
And I want to highlight a different project, but that has some, I'll tell you why my mind goes there. It goes there because we have a number of people working on it in this room. So Lake Charles and Calcasieu Parish are, of course, on I-10. And we have Mayor Nick Hunter and Alan Wainwright, a number of people from Lake Charles and Calcasieu, including the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the Water Institute, Rick Richard. Sometimes it requires the city and the parish taking matters into their own hands and leading. At the Water Institute, we're really honored to be working with the city of Lake Charles, Calcasieu Parish Police Jury, the Port of Lake Charles, in putting together really the first of its kind in this geography around real-time forecasting. So this is something that Ehab Maselli earlier talked a little bit about, some of the visualization tools. When a parish like that takes it into their own, a parish in a city like this, as is happening in Lake Charles and Calcasieu, takes it into their own hands, they're able to develop tools that are very important for that particular community, but it's also a model for other areas. I remember hearing from some of our colleagues in the city of New Orleans when Mayor Mitch Landrieu read about what Lake Charles and Calcasieu Parish were doing and jumped on it and said, the Water Institute is working with others to develop real-time forecasting for Calcasieu and Lake Charles. We should have that as well. And there's a movement now around trying to see to what degree those tools can help watersheds across the state of Louisiana. That, to me, is very exciting bridging of technology, of science, of analysis, and of tools coming together in a real tangible way where you put the dollars together, you get the right people together, leaders like Mayor Nick Hunter. It's the type of tools and methodology. Again, that's what this is really about. Seeing it all come together and put into practice. So again, we didn't choose to be in this situation, but because we are, it forces us to come together in ways where we've really been able to put some exciting things together. Are there other questions and comments?
I'd like you to talk about this at scale. As you know, here and in Houston, what happens in a catastrophe, even when people are warned, and the ability of people to evacuate and the sheer chaos of that process. And this is not to minimize what you're doing, it's to say, how do you move what you're doing to maybe, I guess the ideal is Holland, that's probably been at this, recognized their problem long before we recognized ours and built it into their culture and their system, but we haven't. How do you think about this when you think about the coastal cities, coastal beachfronts, all the way around the Gulf of Mexico and up the Atlantic coast, not to mention the Pacific coast? How does the nation move to this place of thinking and planning? Because it's not just going to be the island that you talked about. It's going to be major cities, as we've seen. How do we get there? Because you're somewhere out here, and the rest of the country is on the other side of the river somewhere. And they're not thinking about the scale and the cost and the economics of mass movement of people from the communities in which they live.
Well, I think it's a great observation. I think a lot of this has to do with interdependencies and how society functions as a system, cascading effects. So as soon as that there's a disaster, how does it impact the chain as a whole? And that's, I think, a question of scale. It happens at every scale: facility scale, city scale, regional scale. Say if something were to happen with Miami, what is the national impact of that? So it's not just South Florida, it's beyond South Florida. For example, we had the RPA assembly last week, and in New York City, a big discussion on the Holland Tunnel. The Holland Tunnel is in very poor shape, again, Robert Moses. What is the impact of that? What is the spin-off? But at the same time, it translates to solutions as well, solution strategies. So can you think about local interventions that have regional spin-off? Where can you have and make smart investments where the sum of the pieces is bigger than the individual pieces? Difficult translation, but you get what I'm saying.
If I could take a whack at that, I think first of all, not every place is going to make it, not in the way that they envision for themselves. In the same way that we have cities that were once thriving 100 years ago that are not thriving cities today. New Orleans is one of those, by the way. It's about 2/3 the size it was in the 1960s. I think the key, though, is that you can't ask the nation or anyone else to invest in you more than you invest in yourself. And I think that's the fundamental part of this. I mean, these are essentially societal partnerships we're talking about putting together. And I don't know of any basis for going to the Congress or the people of the United States or commercial markets or anything else and ask them to bail you out if you do not have something for them to buy into. I mean, part of what I think you've seen on Ilda Jean Charles had the people on that island. And for those of you who don't know, most of the members of that community are Native Americans, and they're members of a certain tribe, a state-recognized tribe, not a federally recognized tribe. Had they not organized themselves into that tribe, I don't think they would have been as eligible, because you had to have something that defined what the community is that you were talking about. And I think that was a fundamentally important piece of them making themselves eligible. That is going to be huge. There are a handful of cities here and globally that have natural reasons to commit to or natural opportunities. Parts of South Louisiana have a bit of both. I mean, this is still the junction between a hemisphere, a continental river system and commerce system and the rivers and the oceans of the world. I just got back from Virginia, where places like Norfolk have the world's largest naval base. You can't just pick up and move things like that. So there are places, there are already built-in default reasons for investing, but that's not necessarily going to buy into the, to mean investment in the entire community. They're trying to figure that out, what your story is. And that gets to where I think policy comes in. Policy, for my purposes, by the way, is nothing more than the story you tell to explain what you're doing or not doing. But if you don't have a story, don't expect to be, given much attention.
And Marc said something very important, I think, in his, Marc Davis did in his opening comments. He mentioned the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority. There wasn't always one of those in this state. Being able to get state agencies together, I think, to be able to talk about a common set of issues where they have different pieces is incredibly important. And that work continues in this state. Having a master plan that all of the efforts around the coastal zone can feed into, powered by the best available science, is incredibly important. One of the things that this state did that I think is rightly lauded is by having a science-based plan, you don't pick, there's never going to be enough money to do everything that everyone would like to do. But the worst thing in the world would be is to pick project based on who screams the loudest, or where the politics were compelling. Because I think at the core of your question is that we have to adapt. And so anybody who, there used to be people who promised, we're going to save the coast in this state. We're going to save it. We're going to make it like it was in the 30s. And I think we've all come to appreciate that that's not possible. So the question is, how can you restore, how can you protect, and how can you adapt in a thoughtful way? And again, I think that the panelists here have all added their perspective on how that gets done in this area as well as others. Duke.
I just wanted to respond to Mark's comment to Steve's question, maybe as a point of summary. Having spent a lot of my life in New Orleans, Tulane grad, I think what we experienced with Katrina was the nation considering that question. As it observed Katrina, what are we going to do about that? Now, there's a city with a story, one of the exceptional stories in the country, a city that had to be in a place where it probably shouldn't be, but for defensive purposes and all kinds of things, you had to have New Orleans there. But as people observed people in those difficult conditions, many of whom didn't look like a lot of us in this room, what's the current story? What are you doing below sea level? Why are those people impoverished? What about your school system? That's not the story that was going to cause people to run to the service of that community the way we might have hoped. So I think Katrina was really instructive, might even have inspired 10X, looking at these other cities which are also vulnerable and how we will collectively come to support our fellow citizens when they're in dire straits, and especially in a situation where we knew eventually they were going to find themselves in that circumstance. That's true for a lot of these cities. But I think the idea of connecting narrative to scale, what's the story? What are you trying to communicate that should cause us to care, frankly, and at scale?
And I think that's an excellent segue into where we're going to go, next. The river model that you will see is important from a scientific perspective, but it's also so important from telling the story, because we can explain it, we can talk about the challenge, but when you see it and are able to embrace that challenge and it looks you in the face, you're able to see why partnership, why bringing all these different sectors together is so imperative. So will you please join me in a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you.